April 15th, 1945. The island of Okinawa trembled under a grey sky, its coral cliffs scarred by months of conflict. In a makeshift detention compound near the village of Shuri, hundreds of civilian detainees huddled behind barbed wire, their faces hollow with exhaustion and uncertainty. Among the guards assigned to watch over them stood Corporal James Washington of the 3rd Marine Division, a man who had traveled 7,000 miles from his home in Mississippi only to find himself confronting questions that no training manual could answer. The official policy was clear, the rations were measured, and fraternization was strictly forbidden. What Washington could not have known on that rain-soaked afternoon was that a single act of compassion, whispered in secrecy and executed in defiance of regulations, would challenge everything he thought he understood about duty, humanity, and the invisible lines that war draws between people. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one Marine's choice to see beyond uniform and circumstance would reveal that sometimes the most profound acts of courage occur not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when we choose to recognize the humanity in those we have been trained to consider enemies. James Washington had never imagined himself standing guard over anyone when he enlisted in 1943. Born in the cotton country outside Meridian, Mississippi, he had grown up understanding the weight of a gaze that judged before knowing, the burden of expectations that had nothing to do with character or capability. The Marine Corps had accepted his service, but assigned him to segregated units, relegated to logistics and guard duties, while white Marines received combat postings. He had loaded supplies at Guadalcanal, guarded equipment at Saipan, and now found himself on Okinawa, tasked with overseeing a detention facility that held Japanese civilians caught in the grinding machinery of war. The compound stretched across 3 acres of muddy ground, surrounded by wire fencing and watchtowers. Inside, approximately 800 civilians lived in conditions that ranged from barely adequate to desperate. Most were women, children, and elderly men, evacuated from villages in the path of advancing forces or found hiding in caves after their homes had been consumed by the conflict. They slept in canvas tents when weather permitted, huddled in hastily constructed shelters when the spring rains turned the ground to soup. The Marine Corps provided rations according to established protocols, but those protocols had been designed for orderly situations, not for the chaos of an island where supply lines stretched thin and every resource competed for priority. Washington had been assigned to the compound for 6 weeks when he first noticed her. She sat apart from the other detainees, a young woman perhaps 25 years old, though hardship had carved lines around her eyes that suggested a much longer life. She wore the remnants of what had once been a good quality kimono, now patched and stained, and she held a small child against her chest, a girl no more than 3 years old who whimpered constantly from hunger or cold or both. The woman never spoke to the other detainees, never joined the lines that formed when rations were distributed. She simply sat beneath a crude shelter, fashioned from a piece of canvas and 2 wooden poles, rocking the child and staring at nothing. The other guards paid her little attention. To most of them, the detainees were an undifferentiated mass, a problem to be managed rather than individuals to be known. But Washington found himself watching her during his patrol rounds, troubled by her isolation and the child's persistent crying. On his 4th day of observation, he asked Lieutenant Morrison, the compound administrator, about her situation. Morrison consulted his ledger, running a finger down columns of names written in both English and laboriously copied Japanese characters. The woman's name was Keiko Tanaka, and she had been brought to the compound 11 days earlier, after being discovered in a cave system near the Makinato line. Unlike most detainees who came from farming families or fishing villages, she had lived in Naha City before the conflict reached Okinawa. Her husband had been a schoolteacher, conscripted into service, and sent north 3 months before the American forces landed. She had received no word of him since. The child was their daughter, Yuki. "What makes her different from the others?" Washington asked. Morrison shrugged, his attention already drifting to other administrative concerns. "She refuses to accept full rations," he said, "takes only half of what she is allocated, says the food is not hers to take. that it belongs to the emperor's subjects who are truly in need. It is some kind of misguided honor system. We cannot force her to eat, so we document her refusal and move on. The answer left Washington unsettled. He had witnessed many things during his 2 years in the Pacific, but the spectacle of someone choosing hunger in the midst of plenty, even the meager plenty of a detention camp, struck him as fundamentally wrong. That evening, as he completed his patrol, he lingered near her shelter, close enough to observe but not so close as to alarm. The woman sat with her back against a wooden crate, the child asleep in her lap. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved silently, forming words in a prayer or conversation with someone far away. Washington moved on, but the image stayed with him. That night, lying on his cot in the guards' quarters, he thought about his own mother, who had raised 7 children on a sharecropper's wages and never once complained about her portion. He thought about the meals she had skipped so that her children could eat, the way she had always claimed she was not hungry, even when her hands trembled from exhaustion and malnutrition. He recognized in Keiko Tanaka's refusal something he had seen before, the peculiar mathematics of maternal sacrifice that transcended language and nationality. The recognition troubled him precisely because it complicated the narrative he had been given. The enemy was supposed to be alien, fundamentally different in thought and feeling. Yet here was a woman whose love for her child looked exactly like the love he had known in his own childhood, whose suffering carried the same quality as the suffering he had witnessed in every community he had ever known. The realization opened a crack in the mental architecture that had made soldiering possible, and through that crack came questions he was not sure he wanted to answer. 3 days later, the situation deteriorated. The spring rains intensified, turning the compound into a bog. Supply deliveries fell behind schedule as transport vehicles struggled with washed-out roads and overwhelmed logistics networks. The standard ration allocation was reduced by 15% across all detention facilities on the island. For the civilian detainees, already subsisting on minimal provisions, the reduction pushed conditions from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Washington watched as the daily distribution line grew more agitated, as arguments broke out over portions and guards struggled to maintain order. Keiko Tanaka did not join the line. She remained in her shelter, the child increasingly listless in her arms. On the afternoon of the 4th day of reduced rations, Washington passed near enough to hear the child crying, a weak, exhausted sound that barely rose above the background noise of the compound. He paused, looked around to ensure no other guards were watching, and approached the shelter. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of profound weariness. He gestured toward the child, then toward his own stomach, using the simple signs that had become common language between guards and detainees. "Are you hungry? Is the child hungry?" Keiko Tanaka bowed her head slightly but said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Washington hesitated, acutely aware of the regulations he was about to violate. Fraternization with detainees was forbidden. Unauthorized distribution of rations could result in disciplinary action, possibly even a court-martial. Yet as he looked at the child's hollow cheeks and the mother's trembling hands, the regulations seemed abstract, disconnected from the immediate reality of suffering before him. He had joined the Marines to serve his country, but he had also been raised to believe that service meant something more than blind obedience to rules that produced cruelty. He made his decision. That evening, after the meal distribution in the guards' mess, he wrapped his own bread ration in a cloth napkin and concealed it inside his jacket. He added a small tin of condensed milk that he had been saving, a luxury item from a care package sent by his church congregation back home. Then he waited until his evening patrol brought him near Keiko Tanaka's shelter under cover of dusk. She was sitting with her back to him when he approached, humming softly to the child. He cleared his throat quietly and she turned, startled. He held out the cloth bundle, keeping his voice low. "For the child," he said, though he doubted she understood English. "For your daughter." Keiko Tanaka stared at the offering, confusion and suspicion crossing her face. Washington unwrapped the cloth enough to reveal the bread and the tin of milk. He pointed to the child, then made a gesture of eating. The woman's eyes widened with understanding, and something else, an emotion he could not quite identify. Tears formed at the corners of her eyes. She shook her head, speaking rapidly in Japanese, her tone urgent and distressed. Washington did not need translation to understand that she was refusing, that accepting food from an enemy soldier violated some code she had been taught to uphold. But he also saw the way her gaze lingered on the bread, the way her hands twitched toward the milk before she forced them still. He stepped closer, setting the bundle on the ground near her feet. Then he spoke the only words he thought might matter, words he hoped would transcend the barrier of language through sheer sincerity. "Don't tell," he whispered. "Please, just don't tell." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him he heard nothing, no movement, no sound. He completed his patrol circuit and returned to the guards' quarters, uncertain whether his offering would be accepted or reported to Lieutenant Morrison by the morning. The next day, when he passed by her shelter during his rounds, the cloth napkin sat folded neatly beside the wooden crate that served as her shelter's support. The bread and milk were gone. The child slept peacefully in her mother's arms, and when Keiko Tanaka glanced up at Washington, she offered the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement so brief it might have been imagined. But Washington knew what he had seen, and something in his chest loosened, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. The secret exchanges became routine over the following weeks. Washington developed a system, taking small portions from his own meals and supplementing them with items scavenged from supply deliveries, extra crackers that would not be missed, canned goods damaged in transport but still edible, fruit that was beginning to turn but remained nutritious. He timed his deliveries for the evening patrol when shadows lengthened and other guards were distracted by the compound's settling routine. Each time he placed the food near her shelter and whispered the same instruction. "Don't tell." Keiko Tanaka never spoke to him directly, but she began to leave small tokens of acknowledgement. A folded paper crane appeared on the wooden crate, crafted from a scrap of newspaper. A smooth stone polished to a gentle shine sat where he usually placed the food. These gifts meant nothing to anyone else, but to Washington they represented a bridge across the void that war had created, a recognition of shared humanity that both transcended and defied their circumstances. The child, Yuki, began to improve. Her crying diminished. Her movements became more energetic. Her cheeks filled out slightly. Keiko Tanaka herself remained thin, and Washington suspected she was still giving most of the food to her daughter, but there was a new quality to her bearing, a straightness to her spine that suggested the burden she carried had become slightly less unbearable. Other Marines began to notice Washington's frequent patrols near that section of the compound. Sergeant Davis, a veteran from Alabama who supervised the guard rotation, pulled him aside one evening. "You spending a lot of time over by the northeast shelters," he observed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Something particular you're watching?" Washington kept his expression carefully blank. "Just being thorough, Sergeant, making sure there are no security concerns." Davis studied him for a long moment. "Security concerns," he repeated. He spat tobacco juice into the mud. "You be careful, Washington. These people, they are not like us. You start thinking they are. You start making mistakes. Mistakes get people hurt." The warning was clear, but Washington noticed that Davis did not forbid him from continuing his patrols. Perhaps the sergeant suspected what was happening and chose to look the other way, or perhaps he simply did not care enough to investigate further. Either way, Washington took the conversation as license to continue, though he became more cautious in his timing and approach. The transformation in Keiko Tanaka and her daughter did not go unnoticed by the other detainees. Gradually, other women began to approach her, speaking in low voices and casting glances toward the guards. Washington watched as a subtle community formed around her shelter, women sharing what little they had, children playing nearby under their mother's watchful eyes. Keiko Tanaka became a kind of quiet anchor, someone who had received unexpected kindness and somehow transmitted that grace to those around her. One evening in early June, as Washington approached with his usual offering, he found Lieutenant Morrison standing near Keiko Tanaka's shelter, reviewing a clipboard. Washington's blood went cold. He had the food concealed in his jacket, and there was no way to retreat without drawing attention. He forced himself to walk forward normally, as though this were just another routine patrol. Morrison looked up as Washington approached. "Corporal," he said, his tone businesslike. "I have been reviewing the health reports from the compound. The medical officer notes significant improvement in the condition of detainee Tanaka and her child. Given that she continues to refuse full ration allocations, he finds this improvement medically curious." Washington kept his face neutral, though his mind raced. "I could not say, sir. Perhaps she has been more willing to accept food recently." Morrison studied him with an expression that suggested he understood more than he was willing to acknowledge. "Perhaps," he agreed. He glanced back at his clipboard. "In any case, the improvement is noted. Good work maintaining security in this sector, Corporal. Carry on?" He walked away, leaving Washington standing alone near the shelter. When he was certain Morrison was out of sight, Washington released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Keiko Tanaka emerged from her shelter, the child on her hip. She looked at Washington with an expression that mixed gratitude and concern, and she spoke a single word in careful, practiced English. "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. The sound of her voice, quiet and deliberate, struck him with unexpected force. He nodded once, unable to trust his own voice, and continued his patrol. The incident with Morrison marked a turning point. Washington realized that others were watching, that his actions, however well-intentioned, existed within a web of observation and judgment that could collapse at any moment. He began to consider what would happen if he were caught. What consequences would follow not just for himself, but for Keiko Tanaka and the other detainees who had come to rely on the small extra provisions he provided. The ethical calculus troubled him. He believed deeply in the rightness of what he was doing, the necessity of recognizing human need above bureaucratic regulation. Yet he also understood that the military structure he had sworn to uphold depended on obedience, on the subordination of individual judgment to collective discipline. Could both things be true simultaneously? Could he be both a good Marine and a good man? Or did the circumstances of war force a choice between competing virtues? These questions occupied his thoughts during the long, humid nights when sleep came slowly. He thought about his father, who had worked the same plot of sharecropped land for 30 years without ever owning the soil he tended. He thought about his older brother, who had been conscripted to work in a defense plant in Detroit and wrote letters home about the strange experience of earning good wages while still being unable to eat at the same lunch counters as white workers. He thought about the fundamental contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while his family remained constrained by Jim Crow at home. In Keiko Tanaka, he saw a reflection of that contradiction. She was labeled enemy, subject to detention and control, yet her daily reality consisted of loving her child, seeking dignity in deprivation, trying to maintain some fragment of the life she had known before forces beyond her control had torn it apart. Her struggle looked remarkably like the struggles he had witnessed all his life, the universal human effort to preserve self and family against systems that regarded individuals as statistics, problems to be managed rather than lives to be honored. The insight did not make him bitter, but it did make him certain. If the war was truly about defending human dignity against tyranny, then that defense had to begin with recognizing dignity wherever it appeared, even in those designated as adversaries. The decision to continue helping Keiko Tanaka was not rebellion against authority, but fidelity to a deeper principle, one that preceded military rank and national boundaries. In mid-June, the compound received orders to prepare for partial evacuation. The conflict on Okinawa was entering its final phase, and military planners anticipated that many civilians would soon be repatriated to secured areas where they could begin rebuilding their lives. The announcement sent ripples of mixed emotion through the detainees, hope at the prospect of returning home balanced against fear of what they might find when they arrived. Washington watched as families gathered their meager belongings and prepared for an uncertain transition. Keiko Tanaka would be among the first group scheduled for relocation. The order listed her and her daughter as bound for a resettlement facility near the village of Itaman, in the southern part of the island, an area that had been secured weeks earlier and designated for civilian return. Washington learned this from the duty roster and felt an unexpected sadness at the news. He had never had a real conversation with Keiko Tanaka, had never learned the details of her life beyond the few facts in Morrison's ledger, yet he felt connected to her in a way that transcended language and circumstance. On her last evening in the compound, he made one final delivery. He had managed to acquire a full can of peaches, a genuine delicacy, and he wrapped it carefully along with 2 chocolate bars from a care package. As he approached her shelter, he found her sitting alone, the child already asleep. She looked up at his approach, and for the first time she smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her face. She gestured for him to sit, and though every regulation screamed against it, he lowered himself to the ground across from her. They sat in silence for several minutes, the quiet broken only by the distant sounds of the compound settling for the night. Then Keiko Tanaka reached into the folds of her kimono and withdrew a small, carefully folded piece of cloth. She extended it toward Washington with both hands, a gesture of formal offering. He took it, mystified, and unfolded the cloth to reveal a delicate origami crane, more intricate than any he had seen before. The paper was actually cloth, a fragment of silk that must have been precious to her, decorated with a pattern of cherry blossoms. He looked up, questioning. Keiko Tanaka spoke slowly, choosing words carefully from her limited English vocabulary. "For hope," she said, "for kindness." She placed a hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. "You give food. I give hope." Washington felt tears prick at his eyes, a reaction he had not experienced since leaving home. The simple eloquence of her statement, the recognition that his small acts had meant something beyond mere nutrition, struck him with profound force. He closed his fingers around the crane, feeling the silk soft against his palm. "Thank you," he said. Then, because it seemed necessary, he added, "I'm sorry. Sorry for everything." Keiko Tanaka nodded, understanding perhaps more than he had said. She pointed to herself, then to him, then made a gesture that encompassed the compound, the island, the vast expanse of ocean and conflict that surrounded them. "All sorry," she said, "all hope for peace." They sat together until full darkness fell, not speaking again, but sharing the silence like old friends. When Washington finally stood to complete his patrol, Keiko Tanaka bowed deeply, a gesture of respect and gratitude. He bowed in return, awkward but sincere, and then he walked away into the night. The next morning, he watched from the guard tower as trucks arrived to transport the first group of detainees to the resettlement facility. Keiko Tanaka stood in line with her daughter on her hip, a small bundle containing their few possessions slung over her shoulder. As the truck pulled away, she turned back one final time and raised her hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or simply acknowledgement. Washington raised his own hand in response, knowing he would almost certainly never see her again. The compound felt different after she left. Washington continued his duties, but the particular purpose that had animated his evenings disappeared. He still helped where he could, still found ways to ease suffering when regulations allowed or could be circumvented, but it was not the same. Keiko Tanaka had represented something specific, a connection that had challenged and ultimately changed his understanding of who deserved compassion and on what terms. Weeks passed. The conflict on Okinawa ground toward its conclusion. The detention compound gradually emptied as civilians were relocated or repatriated. Washington received orders for his next assignment, a transfer to occupation duties on the Japanese mainland, once formal surrender was achieved. The war was ending, though the ending felt less like victory than exhaustion, a collective recognition that the machinery of violence had run its course. On his final day at the compound, Washington was inventorying supplies in the warehouse when Lieutenant Morrison approached, carrying a folder. "Corporal," he said, "I wanted to speak with you before you transfer out." Washington straightened, uncertain what to expect. "Yes, sir." Morrison opened the folder, revealing several sheets of paper covered in official letterhead. "I have been reviewing reports from the resettlement facilities," he said. "One report in particular caught my attention. It concerns detainee Tanaka and her daughter." He paused, watching Washington's reaction. The report notes that upon their arrival at the Itomen facility, both were found to be in significantly better health than their detention records would suggest. The medical officer who examined them specifically remarked that someone must have been providing supplemental nutrition. Washington said nothing, waiting for the accusation or reprimand that must surely follow. Instead, Morrison closed the folder and met his eyes. "I want you to know, Corporal, that I am aware you violated regulations by providing unauthorized rations to detainees. Under normal circumstances, this would warrant disciplinary action." The silence stretched between them. Then Morrison continued, "However, I am also aware that your actions prevented suffering and potentially saved lives during a period of resource scarcity. The report from Itomen specifically notes that Tanaka has been helping to organize food distribution among newly arrived civilians, and that her example of acceptance and cooperation has significantly eased the resettlement process." He paused. "Sometimes regulations serve the mission better when they are bent in service of larger principles. I will not be filing any report of violation." Washington felt as though a weight he had been carrying for months had suddenly lifted. "Thank you, sir." Morrison nodded. "You are a good Marine, Washington. More importantly, you are a good man. The Corps needs both. Dismissed." As Washington left the warehouse, the origami crane secure in his pocket, he reflected on everything that had transpired. He had entered the war believing that courage meant charging into danger, that service meant following orders without question. He left with a more complex understanding, the recognition that sometimes the truest courage consisted of small, quiet acts of defiance against dehumanization, that the highest service involved preserving human dignity, even when systems and circumstances conspired to erase it. Years later, after returning home to Mississippi and building a life that included a wife, children, and a career as a teacher, Washington would often take out the silk crane and remember those weeks on Okinawa. He would remember a woman whose name he could barely pronounce, who had lost everything but maintained her dignity and taught him something essential about the nature of humanity. He would remember the weight of that concealed food in his jacket, the whispered words "don't tell," the silent acknowledgement that passed between them in the compound's twilight. He would tell his children about her, though he simplified the story for their young ears. He would explain that war created terrible divisions between people, but that individuals always retained the power to choose connection over separation, compassion over indifference. He would teach them that the most important lessons were not found in textbooks, but in the quiet moments when principle collided with convenience, and we had to decide who we wanted to be. The crane remained on his dresser for the rest of his life, a small silk reminder that humanity persists even in humanity's darkest hours. It reminded him that the lines drawn between us, enemy and ally, are often arbitrary, maintained by fear and propaganda, but dissolved by simple recognition of shared suffering and shared hope. It reminded him that courage comes in many forms, that sometimes the bravest act is not to fight, but to feed, not to destroy, but to preserve. Keiko Tanaka herself, he would learn many years later through an unexpected letter, had survived the war and rebuilt her life in Naha City. Her husband returned from service, damaged but alive. They had 2 more children. She became a teacher, specializing in English language instruction, and she made it her mission to teach her students that former enemies could become friends when both sides chose to see each other clearly. The letter included a photograph, a family portrait showing Keiko, now gray-haired and smiling, surrounded by her grown children and grandchildren. The daughter Washington had helped feed, Yuki, had become a doctor. The letter thanked him for his kindness during the darkest period of her life. It told him that his simple act of sharing food had given her reason to believe in human goodness at a time when such belief seemed impossible. It explained that she had spent the decades since the war trying to repay that kindness by extending it to others, by teaching children that compassion transcends nationality and that we are all, ultimately, members of the same human family. Washington wept when he read the letter, an old man's tears for the young people they had been. Caught in circumstances neither had chosen, but both had tried to meet with grace. He wrote back immediately, pouring onto paper thoughts and feelings he had carried for 40 years. They corresponded regularly after that, letters traveling across the Pacific with news of children and grandchildren, reflections on the war and its long aftermath, shared hopes for a world where such conflicts would become impossible. When Washington died at the age of 78, His family found the crane in his hand. They buried it with him, along with the bundle of letters from Keiko Tanaka, honoring his request that these tokens of connection accompany him into whatever came next. At the funeral, his eldest daughter read from one of Tanaka's letters, a passage that seemed to capture everything her father had tried to teach them about living honorably in a complicated world. The passage read, "In war, we are told who to hate and who to fear. But war cannot tell us who to love, who to help, who to recognize as deserving of mercy. Those choices remain ours, even when choosing feels dangerous or forbidden. Your father chose to see my daughter and me as human beings, worthy of kindness, when it would have been easier and safer to see us as enemies worthy of neglect. That choice, repeated in small acts over many weeks, did not change the war or alter history's great movements, but it changed us. It changed everything that followed in our lives. It proved that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual humans retain the capacity for beauty and grace." The people gathered at the funeral understood, perhaps for the first time, the full measure of what James Washington had carried with him from that island compound. They understood that heroism was not always loud or spectacular, that sometimes it consisted of nothing more than recognizing another person's hunger and choosing to address it, whatever the personal cost or risk. The story did not end there. Keiko Tanaka, elderly but determined, traveled to Mississippi for a memorial service held 6 months after Washington's death. She met his widow, his children, his grandchildren. She shared stories about their brief connection and its long reverberations, about how his kindness had rippled outward through her life and the lives of everyone she touched. She brought with her a gift, a collection of origami cranes made by her students, each one carrying a message of gratitude to a man they had never met but whose example had been passed down through generations. The meeting between these two families, American and Japanese, former enemies brought together by one man's quiet courage, became a small news story in the local paper. The reporter who covered it understood that he was witnessing something profound, evidence that individual choices matter even when larger forces seem overwhelming, that the decision to honor human dignity transcends nationality, race, and historical circumstance. The story spread further when a documentary filmmaker researching accounts of the Pacific conflict encountered the article and tracked down both families for interviews. The resulting short film, which aired on educational television, captured the essence of what had passed between Washington and Tanaka, the simple exchange of food and hope that had meant so much to both. It won several awards and was shown in schools across the United States and Japan, introducing new generations to the idea that our common humanity matters more than our designated differences. In Okinawa itself, the story became part of the local history. A memorial was established at the site of the old detention compound, now covered by modern buildings, but remembered through historical markers and preserved photographs. The memorial includes text in both English and Japanese, telling the story of Corporal James Washington and Keiko Tanaka, of how a black Marine from Mississippi and a Japanese schoolteacher's wife found connection across the boundaries of war. School groups visit the memorial regularly, learning about the period when their island became a crossroads of conflict and suffering, but also learning that, even in such times, individuals chose kindness. The narrative that emerged from Washington's simple act of sharing rations became more than a personal story. It became a parable about moral courage, about the importance of seeing past categories to recognize individual humanity. It demonstrated that the choice to help someone, even when regulations forbid it and circumstances discourage it, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Washington fed a hungry child and gave hope to a desperate mother, but in doing so, he also planted seeds that would grow into understanding, reconciliation, and peace. His own family came to understand their father and grandfather in new ways through this late-life revelation. They had known him as a quiet man who rarely spoke about the war, who focused on his teaching career and his community involvement, but kept his military service largely private. The discovery of his connection to Keiko Tanaka revealed depths they had not suspected, showed them that his lifelong commitment to dignity and justice had roots in specific acts of conscience, performed under difficult circumstances. For Keiko Tanaka's family, the story provided context for their mothers' and grandmothers' unwavering belief in cross-cultural understanding. They had grown up hearing her insist that Americans were not enemies, but people, that the hardships of war should teach lessons about peace rather than fuel cycles of resentment. Now they understood where that conviction had originated, in the kindness of a young Marine who could have remained indifferent but chose engagement instead. The two families maintained contact after that first memorial meeting. They exchanged visits, celebrated holidays together when possible, and built friendships that honored the connection forged by their elders. Washington's grandchildren and Tanaka's grandchildren became friends, pen pals who shared details of their lives and discovered that their dreams and struggles had more similarities than differences. They represented the future their grandparents had hoped for, a world where former antagonists became partners in building something better. In the broader sweep of history, Washington and Tanaka's story remained a footnote, a minor incident in a conflict that consumed millions of lives and reshaped the global order. But footnotes matter. They remind us that history is not only made by generals and politicians, by those who command armies or negotiate treaties. It is also made by corporals who share their rations and mothers who accept forbidden gifts to feed their children. It is made in the small spaces where human beings meet each other without the armor of ideology or the distance of abstraction, where we recognize that the person before us is not an enemy but simply another soul trying to survive and maintain dignity in an undignified world. The lesson Washington taught through his actions was one that every generation must relearn. Systems and institutions will always create categories, will always draw lines between us and them, will always provide rationales for treating some people as less worthy of consideration than others. But individuals can choose to ignore those categories, to step across those lines, to recognize that the rationales are constructed and therefore can be deconstructed. We can choose to see clearly even when clarity is discouraged. We can choose connection even when separation seems safer. We can choose kindness even when kindness requires courage. This is not to say that war is ever justified, or that individual acts of compassion erase the violence and suffering that conflict produces. Washington's kindness to Tanaka did not undo the destruction of Okinawa, did not resurrect the dead or restore what had been lost, but it did prove that even within the machinery of war, human agency persists. Even when enormous forces push us toward cruelty or indifference, we retain the ability to make different choices, to honor the better angels of our nature, rather than surrender to the worst. The story challenges us to consider how we respond to those designated as other in our own time. The specific circumstances change. Wars give way to different conflicts. Enemies shift. But the fundamental question remains constant. When we encounter someone in need, someone whom systems or circumstances have marked as unworthy of our concern, what do we do? Do we honor the official designation and maintain distance, or do we risk the consequences of recognizing their humanity and responding accordingly? Washington's answer was clear. He looked at a hungry child and a suffering mother, and he saw not enemy detainees but human beings in need. He possessed the power to address that need, and he used it, whatever the potential cost. He whispered, "Don't tell," because he understood that his actions violated expectations, but he acted anyway because some things matter more than compliance. He chose to be the kind of person who feeds the hungry, even when the hungry wear the wrong uniform or speak the wrong language. The choice seems simple in retrospect, obvious and uncomplicated, but we must remember the context. Washington lived in a society that had spent his entire life telling him that he was less than, that his humanity was conditional, that he should accept diminishment as natural and inevitable. He served in a military that maintained segregation and relegated him to secondary roles despite his capabilities. He guarded people who had been designated as enemies, who belonged to a nation that had caused tremendous suffering and death. Any one of these factors might have justified indifference or even active cruelty, yet he chose otherwise. He chose to extend to Keiko Tanaka the dignity that his own society often denied him. He chose to treat her as a full human being worthy of consideration and help, creating a circle of compassion that transcended the circles of oppression in which both were caught. His choice demonstrated that being subjected to injustice does not require perpetuating injustice, that we can break cycles of dehumanization by simply refusing to participate, by insisting on recognition and connection even when everything around us militates against it. Understanding Washington's background provides essential context for appreciating the magnitude of his choice. He had grown up in Meridian, Mississippi, during the height of Jim Crow segregation, in a world where every public space reinforced messages of racial hierarchy. The schools he attended were underfunded and overcrowded, provided with second-hand textbooks and facilities that white schools had discarded. His father worked land he could never own, trapped in a sharecropping system that differed from slavery, more in name than in practical reality. His mother cleaned houses for white families, returning home exhausted each evening to care for her own children with whatever energy remained. Despite these constraints, Washington's parents had instilled in him a fierce dignity and sense of self-worth. His mother in particular had insisted that external circumstances did not determine internal value, that a person's character mattered more than the arbitrary categories society imposed. She had taught him to see clearly the injustice around him, while refusing to let that injustice poison his capacity for compassion. When Washington was 12 years old, his mother had taken him aside after he came home angry about yet another indignity suffered at school. She had told him something he never forgot. The world will give you many reasons to become hard and bitter. You must choose every day not to let those reasons win. You must insist on remaining human, on seeing others as human, no matter what the world tells you. Those words had stayed with Washington through his adolescence and into his military service. They had sustained him through the bitter experience of training at segregated facilities, of being assigned to labor battalions while less qualified white recruits received combat postings, of being treated as second class even while wearing the uniform of his country. They had created in him a kind of moral foundation that could not be shaken by external events, a commitment to dignity and compassion that existed independent of how he was treated. When Washington encountered Keiko Tanaka in that detention compound, he was not acting out of naive idealism or ignorance of the world's cruelties. He was acting from a deeply rooted understanding that maintaining one's humanity required constant, conscious effort, that the choice to see and respond to suffering was something that had to be renewed again and again in the face of systems and circumstances that made indifference easier. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be reduced to a category rather than recognized as an individual. That knowledge made it impossible for him to turn away from someone experiencing similar erasure, even when that person spoke a different language and belonged to a designated enemy population. The parallel experiences of marginalization created an unexpected bridge between Washington and Tanaka. Though their specific circumstances differed dramatically, both had lived lives constrained by forces beyond their control. Both had been told that their value was conditional and their aspirations should be limited. Both had fought to maintain dignity in systems designed to strip it away. Tanaka had been educated and cultured, a woman who had enjoyed certain privileges within her society, but those privileges had evaporated when conflict came to Okinawa. She had been reduced to refugee status, stripped of home and security, forced to accept charity and detention, while worrying constantly about her husband's fate and her daughter's future. In the compound, she occupied a liminal space, neither fully enemy nor fully victim in the eyes of her captors. The guards saw detainees as a category to be managed, rather than as individuals with distinct histories and personalities. To most of them, the differences between the woman who had been a farmer's wife and the woman who had been married to a schoolteacher were invisible and irrelevant. They were all simply Japanese civilians, people to be fed adequately but not generously, housed safely but not comfortably, processed efficiently through a system designed for utility rather than recognition. Washington's decision to see Keiko Tanaka as an individual rather than a category member violated more than just regulations about unauthorized ration distribution. It violated the fundamental logic of the detention system, which depended on maintaining categorical distance between guards and guarded, on preserving the abstraction that made indifference possible. By learning her name, Observing her specific circumstances, recognizing her maternal love and suffering as deserving of response, Washington broke through the institutional barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of personal connection. The risk he took was not primarily physical. The compound was secure, the detainees posed no threat to the guards, and Washington was never in danger from the people he was helping. The risk was professional and social, the possibility of discipline or demotion if his actions were discovered and reported, the certainty of disapproval from fellow guards who maintained the proper distance, the potential damage to his already limited prospects for advancement within a segregated military structure. For a black Marine already disadvantaged by the racial hierarchy of his time, any additional mark against his record could have serious consequences. Yet Washington calculated, perhaps unconsciously, that some risks were worth taking. He had joined the military believing the rhetoric about fighting for freedom and human dignity, about defending a way of life that honored individual worth. The cognitive dissonance of serving those ideals while being subjected to discrimination had forced him to develop his own internal compass, to decide for himself what those ideals meant and how to live them, regardless of institutional hypocrisy. Helping Keiko Tanaka became an expression of that internal compass, a way of asserting that the principles he believed in mattered even when the systems around him failed to honor them. The evolution of their relationship, such as it was, occurred entirely through gesture and implication. They could not have extended conversations, could not share stories or jokes or the small talk that builds ordinary human connection. But within the constraints of their situation, they developed a form of communication that transcended language. Washington learned to read Tanaka's body language, to distinguish between the exhaustion that indicated she needed food and the distress that indicated the child was ill. Tanaka learned to anticipate Washington's patrol schedule, to position herself where he could easily make his deliveries without attracting attention from other guards. Their mutual understanding developed its own protocols. Washington never approached when other Marines were nearby. Tanaka never acknowledged the gifts in front of other detainees, understanding that such acknowledgement might create jealousy or suspicion. They both maintained the fiction of categorical distance in public while nurturing connection in the brief private moments that the compound's rhythms permitted. This dual consciousness, the ability to perform one role while inhabiting another, was something both understood intimately from their respective experiences of navigating hierarchical societies. The gifts Tanaka left for Washington, the paper cranes and polished stones, carried layers of meaning that neither could fully articulate, but both somehow understood. In Japanese culture, the crane symbolized hope, longevity, and good fortune, gifts given to express gratitude and to wish blessing on the recipient. By crafting cranes from scraps of paper and cloth, Tanaka was doing more than simply acknowledging Washington's kindness. She was asserting her own agency and dignity, demonstrating that even in detention, stripped of material resources, she retained the capacity to give rather than only receive, to create beauty rather than simply endure deprivation. For Washington, these tokens became tangible proof that his actions mattered, that the risks he took achieved something beyond mere physical sustenance. They validated his instinct that connection was possible across the boundaries of language and nationality, that human beings could recognize and honor each other's humanity, even in circumstances explicitly designed to prevent such recognition. He kept the first crane she gave him in his pocket throughout his remaining time on Okinawa, a talisman that reminded him of why he had joined the service and what principles he refused to compromise regardless of external pressure. The broader context of the Okinawa campaign provided constant reminder of what was at stake in these small acts of humanity. The island had become a charnel house, a place where military necessity ground through civilian populations with horrific efficiency. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians had perished in the crossfire, been caught in bombardments or taken their own lives in desperation as they were caught between competing forces. The detention compounds represented, in theory, a more humane approach, a recognition that civilians should be removed from combat zones and provided basic security and sustenance while military operations continued. But theory and practice diverged significantly. The compounds were overcrowded and undersupplied, administered by personnel who had no training in civilian management and often viewed the detainees with suspicion or contempt. Disease spread quickly in the cramped conditions. Medical care was minimal, prioritized for military personnel with civilian needs, addressed only when resources permitted. Food supplies remained chronically inadequate, calculated to prevent starvation, but not to provide genuine nutrition or comfort. The detainees existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully prisoners nor free civilians, waiting for a future that remained uncertain, while enduring a present that ground away at their physical and emotional reserves. Within this grim context, Washington's small interventions took on outsized significance. The extra rations he provided did more than fill stomachs. They demonstrated that someone saw, that someone cared, that the apparatus of war and detention had not completely eradicated individual human conscience. For Keiko Tanaka, this demonstration meant everything. She had spent weeks wondering if she and her daughter would simply disappear into the machinery of conflict, become statistics in some future accounting of casualties and displaced persons. Washington's gifts told her that she remained visible, that her suffering registered with at least one person, that her daughter's hunger mattered to someone beyond herself. This visibility had profound psychological effects. Researchers who later studied civilian detention during the conflict noted that one of the most damaging aspects of such confinement was the sense of erasure it produced, the feeling that one had ceased to exist as an individual and become merely a unit to be processed. Detainees who maintained connections, who experienced recognition from guards or administrators, showed significantly better psychological outcomes than those who remained isolated within the categorical designation of detainee. Washington could not have known this research, which would not be conducted for decades, but his instincts told him something similar, that treating Tanaka as a person rather than a problem represented more than simple kindness. It represented resistance against the dehumanizing logic of war itself. The other Marines in Washington's unit noticed his behavior, but interpreted it through their own frameworks of understanding. Some assumed he was simply soft, too gentle-hearted for the hardness that military service required. Others thought he was naive, failing to maintain the proper psychological distance that would protect him from emotional entanglement with enemy populations. A few suspected romantic interest, though they could not imagine how such interest could be acted upon given the circumstances. None understood the true nature of what was occurring, the way Washington was working out his own moral philosophy through small, repeated acts of conscience. Sergeant Davis, Washington's immediate supervisor, came closest to understanding. Davis himself had grown up poor in rural Alabama, had experienced hunger and deprivation, and retained more empathy than most for those in difficult circumstances. He noticed Washington's frequent patrols near the northeast section of the compound, but chose not to investigate too closely. Davis operated by a practical philosophy that valued results over strict adherence to every regulation. As long as Washington performed his duties satisfactorily and caused no obvious problems, Davis was willing to allow him latitude in how he conducted his patrols. This administrative tolerance, itself a form of quiet resistance against rigid institutional thinking, created the space within which Washington's actions became possible. Lieutenant Morrison represented a different type of military officer, one who understood that complex situations sometimes required flexible responses. Morrison had observed Washington carefully over several weeks before their conversation about Keiko Tanaka's improved condition. He had noticed the pattern of Washington's patrols, the small discrepancies in supply inventories, the way certain detainees in Washington's sector seemed healthier than statistical models would predict. Morrison could have reported these observations and triggered an investigation that would likely have resulted in Washington's discipline or reassignment. Instead, Morrison made a calculation of his own. He recognized that Washington's actions, while technically violations of protocol, were producing beneficial outcomes. The detainees in Washington's sector caused fewer disciplinary problems, cooperated more readily with administrative requirements, and showed better morale than those in sectors where guards maintained strict categorical distance. Morrison understood something that formal regulations often missed, that humane treatment of detainees, was not just morally correct but practically effective, that people who felt seen and respected were far easier to manage than people who felt invisible and disrespected. Morrison's decision not to report Washington reflected a kind of institutional wisdom that exists in tension with official policy. Militaries depend on rigid hierarchies and strict rule-following to function under the chaos of conflict, but they also depend on the judgment and initiative of individual personnel who must adapt general policies to specific circumstances. The best officers understand when to enforce regulations strictly and when to allow subordinates room to exercise their own judgment. Morrison recognized in Washington someone who could be trusted with that room, whose violations of protocol served rather than undermined the larger mission of maintaining order and security while treating civilians humanely. This recognition had long-term effects on Washington's military career. Though he never achieved high rank or received public commendation for his actions on Okinawa, Morrison's positive reports followed him through subsequent assignments. When Washington transferred to occupation duties on the Japanese mainland after the conflict ended, he carried with him a reputation as someone who could be trusted in sensitive situations involving civilian populations. His ability to navigate complex ethical terrain while maintaining discipline and achieving results made him valuable to commanders who understood that occupation required different skills than combat. This is the deepest lesson of the story, the truth that resonates across decades and circumstances. We are not helpless before the tides of history or the dictates of systems. We retain agency, the power to choose how we treat the people we encounter, the ability to honor human dignity even when doing so carries risk. The choices we make in these moments, the small acts of courage or kindness we perform when no one is watching or everyone is watching but disapproving, these shape who we are and what kind of world we create. James Washington could not end the war. He could not prevent the suffering that conflict brings or undo the damage already done. But he could offer bread and milk to a hungry child. He could show a desperate mother that someone saw her, that someone cared. He could create a moment of grace in the midst of violence, a space where human connection proved stronger than official enmity. And those small gifts, offered at personal risk with no expectation of recognition or reward, changed lives in ways he could never have predicted. They changed Keiko Tanaka's life by giving her reason to hope and believe in human goodness. They changed her daughter's life by providing the nutrition that allowed her to grow strong and eventually become a healer. They changed Washington's own life by confirming his sense of himself as someone who honors principles over convenience, who acts on convictions even when acting is difficult. And they changed countless other lives through the ripples that spread outward, through the stories told and lessons learned, through the example set and carried forward. This is how the world changes, not through grand gestures or dramatic revolutions, though those have their place, but through the accumulation of individual choices to see clearly and act rightly. Washington did not set out to be a hero or create a legend. He simply saw someone suffering and chose to help. That choice multiplied across millions of similar moments when people choose connection over division, kindness over cruelty, recognition over indifference, is what gradually bends the arc toward justice, what slowly builds the world we hope to inhabit. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.